This idea of human rights, I'm just going to pause for a second. Do you even really have an understanding of what human rights are? Because we talk about it all the time. We talk about it all the time. Do you have an idea of what human rights are? Are there a list? Are there a number of them? Is it like the Bill of Rights? Is there a list you can check off to make sure that each one of your human rights is being honored? Ask yourself that question. What the are human rights? Because we do talk about it all the time, but what are human rights? One of the toughest things about grad school was that master's thesis. It was a rigorous process to get it done, and it really pushed me beyond limits that I even knew I was capable of at the time. I cannot lie to you. One of the things I did not expect to uncover while preparing for this thesis was this idea of colonialism, because I was in the School of Business. But what ended up happening was it was time to do the thesis, and there were like certain subjects or groups in which you could choose related to what was international management. So for me, I was drawn to this idea of human rights. Human rights. What I was also drawn to was the idea of colonialism as it relates to human rights, because I found that term so interesting living there. I just found it so interesting. Human rights. What my whole thesis, the question was, it was an exploratory study centered around human rights. And the question ultimately was, does a colonial relationship between the home and host country of a multinational enterprise influence how it responds to an alleged human rights violation? Now, I know that was a bit long of a sentence. That's how that academic mumbo jumbo be going, man. It's a crazy way that these people talk. But I'll repeat it again. And just to give a little bit more context, multinational enterprise, or MNE, right? A multinational enterprise is simply a company or a business that has offices in multiple countries, not just one country. So if you are, say Apple, and you have a headquarters in, California, and then you have another office location somewhere else, maybe in Europe or Asia, right? Like you have office locations or you do business in multiple countries. The question was, does a colonial relationship between the home and host country of a multinational enterprise? And so in that example, let's say a home and host country, let's say it's British Petroleum and you're a gas company, right? That's a British gas company. So Nigeria was a British colony, definitely a lot of oil, right? So if I am BP and I am doing business in Nigeria, that would be an example of a home and host country of a multinational enterprise with a colonial link, because Nigeria was a British colony. And so I wanted to explore how that sort of relationship influenced how these sort of companies responded to an alleged human rights violation. And so you might say, okay, interesting. I think it was too. When we look at this idea of human rights, and this is before I started even getting into the research, I started thinking like human rights, like, well, the bulk of human rights violations, you hear about this in these Black and brown impoverished nations. Like you hear about it mostly in Africa and Asia, in these sweatshop-like environments, or these environments of just, it's typically in those locations. That's what I would say from just when I started hearing about human rights in the first place, which was why I was sort of drawn to like, well, what kind of research is behind this? Some of the more common human rights violations is definitely like in retail, when you talk about sweatshops and things of that nature. But you also see it in other industries like oil and gas, and you just see it in so many different elements. And so with that being the basis of the thesis, that requires a significant amount of research on the concept of human rights in a business context, but it's in an academic context as well. So this is like through research publications, this idea of human rights. Also, the idea of colonialism. You have to speak about it not from your opinion, but from a research-based approach. You can't just go out there and say like, oh man, this is some bullshit, like colonialism shouldn't exist. Like you have to have research and evidence. It's not just an opinion, right? So you have to find research on all of these things so you can find something to help answer this question, right? The first thing that really sort of got my attention was the idea of human rights. Human rights is an interesting concept, and I found this interesting for a few different reasons, but this idea of human rights, I'm just gonna pause for a second. Do you even really have an understanding of what human rights are? Because we talk about it all the time. We talk about it all the time. Do you have an idea of what human rights are? Are there a list? Are there a number of them? Is it like the Bill of Rights? Is there a list you can check off to make sure that each one of your human rights is being honored? Ask yourself that question. What the f are human rights? Because we do talk about it all the time, but what are human rights? Can you find a list? Can you make sure you can check off each one so that you can make sure you're getting your rights? Also, in the event that you get that list of human rights, wherever you find it, let's say you get to one item on the list and your right is not being honored. Who do you take that up with? Is it a lawsuit? Do you call the police? Who gets in trouble if you're not getting one of your human rights? If you're not getting your human rights, who can you go to hold someone accountable? Furthermore, who owes you those human rights? Are they even your rights? Like, who is the one or the entity indebted to give you these rights? The sky? The government? All governments? What are human rights? I want you to think about that, because before I did this thesis, I started to realize that I didn't have answers to those questions. But yet we talk about human rights so much, especially in a business context and other contexts. You might be surprised to know that this term, human rights, I have it here. Let me take a look. It was not until 1948 that the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 1948. This is the first time an international document expressed a list of rights in which each human is entitled. This is 1948. Now you might say, man, how do you know this? This is from I got sources. This is from something involved with the United Declaration of Human Rights itself. This is their own words. This isn't my words. This is from the UN's own material that they published in 2015.